Good morning. I think there'll probably people will be joining us as we go along. So good morning. Welcome to the Cholangio-Hepatocellular Carcinoma Canada webinar today. And before we start, I would like to ask you to put your questions in the chat and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. So I want to talk a little bit about our speaker. It's a pleasure to introduce him today. Dr. Howard Lim is a medical oncologist at the BC Cancer Agency. He's based in Vancouver and he specializes in gastrointestinal cancer. And he's a clinical associate professor with the Faculty of Medicine at UBC. He is involved in postgraduate medical education and a co-lead for Competency Medical Education at UBC. Dr. Lim also participates in clinical trials, drug access and approvals, education, ethics, and genomic-based research. On a personal note, Dr. Lim is very knowledgeable, he's approachable, and he's caring, and we are so lucky to have somebody with his expertise speaking with us today. His topic is how medications are approved and funded in Canada. I'd like to welcome Dr. Lim.
Great. Thank you so much, Brenda. And first of all, I'd like to say thank you to you for all your hard work to help support our patients. It's great that we actually have now a true dedicated patient advocacy group for both cholangiocarcinoma and HCC. I think that's been lacking for a very long time. So thank you. I think it's these patient advocacy groups that really help move things forward, especially drug approvals as well. So we'll talk about where the patient advocacy piece comes in as well. So this topic is really about how drugs are approved in Canada and that whole entire process. And certainly we can go into some nuances. I see there's already a question about some of the nuances about funding. So, so here's the background. Unfortunately, our drug budgets keep rising. So often, really, if we start looking at funding every single drug and even how things are currently, over the probably past 10 to 15 years, the drug budgets have had to see increases of around 20 to 30% per year. And unfortunately, it's not very sustainable. I mean, the estimated cost of cancer care for Canada is at almost $40 billion for 2024. Now, that's not the drug costs. That's like our operational costs, the total cost of cancer care. And right now, what we are seeing is that some of these newer therapies can cost almost $5,000 to $10,000 a month per patient. And even if we want to go to the more extreme places like CAR-T, which is really only mainly for lymphoma and myeloma patients, that's almost at $500,000 per patient. So where we're stuck is trying to figure out, number one, evaluating the data when it's published to say, is this safe? Is there efficacy? And then the other part is making sure we're delivering that therapy that's beneficial for patients. But in addition, is it cost effective? So the drug process in Canada there's a lot of steps. Number one is actually the very first step is just that drug discovery where you take, this is where it's really in the petri dishes at the pharmaceutical companies where they have multiple compounds and they put it into like cell lines to figure out the activity. And this is now where we're using artificial intelligence and genomics and all of that science part. And then that results in the preclinical studies. And the preclinical studies is where we test that mainly in animals. And that's looking at that proof of mechanism and trying to figure out that dose and safety ranges. So you can see for drug discovery, you may have 10,000 compounds, and then it gets whittled down to about 250 compounds. And then of those 250 compounds, this is where it starts going into clinical trial applications. So this is the part which you may see in the internet where they're like, this drug is going to cure cancer. This drug is working really well, like vitamin C or ivermectin or things like that. This is where that data is coming from, is all this drug discovery preclinical studies. So I will be honest, I've worked in the lab before. I've cured cancer in mice many, many times. And so far, none of the drugs that I worked on when I was in research have ever made it into human studies. And those are like done well in mice. So you can see that it takes a lot of effort to see that efficacy and benefit that we want in humans. So then now when it goes into clinical studies, there's actually a multitude of phases that a drug has to go through in order to become approved. And so one is what we call a phase 1 study, and this is really looking at that safety perspective. And it's looking at small amounts of patients. So this is where it's never been tried in a human being. And what we do is trying to figure out that dose, and it is pushing things to where, is what are the toxic levels as well as the safe levels. So this is really done in humans. Um, and once we figure out that dose, we move on to what's called phase 2. And this is where we're trying to figure out, does this drug truly work? We may get a signal in the phase 1 when we're trying to figure out the safety data. A phase 2 this is where we're just trying to figure out, do we see a signal of it working? And normally what we do is something called the response rate. And the response rate is sort of how much does the drug shrink the cancer down? That's sort of one of the early markers, which we would say is um, an early marker of maybe this drug has benefit. Now, just because you shrink a cancer down doesn't necessarily mean that person will live much longer, and what we call overall survival. So some of these phase 2 studies, we can get overall survival, and that sort of certainly helps us. Now, it depends on your tumor type. So unfortunately, in cases like liver cancer or cholangiocarcinoma, where patients don't live quite as long, sometimes we can get an overall survival signal because it's just the timeline versus patients with breast cancer. If they live years, or certain lymphomas and they're living years, we can't wait years in order to get that signal of how long someone's going to live. And then based on that, that's where you do what we call a randomized phase 3 study. So phase 3 study is where you have your standard of care. So that's what you want to compare to versus the experimental drug. So again, we think we have something that might be working, but you need now to compare it to what is that standard of care in order to see, is that differential and benefit truly there? And that's where it takes more patience, because that signal of maybe like a 3-month survival benefit or 5-month survival benefit may require like 700, 800 patients for us to say, we think this is a valid thing. So from the research perspective, all the way through the clinical trials, you can already see that can take almost up to 10 years for a drug to actually now get the data to say, hey, we think this drug now actually works. And then comes the data is presented normally at a meeting. There's all the excitement. We see the media press. But now we're coming into the regulatory part, where this is where it gets a bit more complicated in terms of like, how do we get now to people? How do we get the governments to fund it? So this is where it's a regulatory review, and then the marketing part. So this is where we sort of talked about the different phases, where phase 1 is the safety, phase 2 is is there a signal if this works, and phase 3 is comparing it to a new treatment standard. But the Canadian drug process now, then what happens is it has to go to Health Canada. So Health Canada, their job isn't about the funding of the drug. Their job for Health Canada is to look at the data from an objective point of view and say, number one, is this drug safe? And 2, does it have efficacy, or is it effective? So is there a benefit? So that's what Health Canada's job is. And so what they do is they go through the data and make sure that the data is saying what it actually is. Once you get Health Canada approval, and that takes around 6 months, and Health Canada is very similar to the FDA in the sense that their process is the same. So there are processes where Health Canada and FDA do have partnerships where they try to, and there's the EMA as well. So there are partnerships where they try and look, since we're all looking at the same data, are we looking at it the same way? And can we sort of harmonize parts so that drugs can be approved faster, since we're all using the same sort of way of looking at things? The other thing companies can do is make sure when they're developing a clinical trial, so investigating whether their drug is going to be helpful, is to bring it to Health Canada or the European or EMA or the FDA to say, this is our design of the clinical trial. if we get this result, does this meet the bar for possible Health Canada approval? So again, making sure that the methodology matches what the review process is. Now, in Canada, once you have Health Canada approval, technically, if you wanted to, you could have access to the drug, but you would have to pay for it. And so this is what happens with other drugs is if you want to do user pay, say, where like in oncology, in most places, most of your drugs are paid for, but all of us pay for some version of our medications outside of oncology to a certain extent. Then you could technically pay for it, but it's going to be extremely expensive. And this is where the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology and Health comes in. And this process is to review, again, the data about what is that value. And this is where they do the health economics. And so this is where it opens up for physicians as well as patients to provide their viewpoint about what is that value and benefit of this drug for the patient. And this is often where we do involve Brenda, or we involve all the different health advocacy groups to please put in or gather information, and so that this can go into that review process. Because from that perspective, the review process is done by, and there are clinicians there, but they may not be experts within cholangiocarcinoma. No different than, I'm not an expert in breast cancer or lymphoma anymore. So they need to hear that perspective from the patient aspect about what does this really mean to a patient. And then if that gets a recommendation for approval for funding, this then goes into the next step, which is the negotiations with the pharmaceutical companies. So this is what we call the PCPA process, where they try to negotiate what is the base price for the drug. And then it goes to the various provinces for listings and further pricing negotiations. And that's when it becomes available. So yes, this process can be quite lengthy. And there are mechanisms that the government is trying to work on, trying to shorten this. But it does take almost 1 to 2 years for something to go from like the data has been presented to actually fully funded. So this is where I think the public advocacy is trying to advocate for this process to be expedited. But I think it's really not just in terms of the PCP negotiations. It's almost all the way back to like, how can we make sure we're trying to get drugs that maybe show an earlier signal and think about maybe providing access sooner so that we can try and get access to everybody versus like if it's just Health Canada approved, some patients can get it if they have the money, but that's not what our system is about. It's about trying to make sure everybody gets access equally. So this is where we're talking about is Health Canada is responsible for determining that the drug is safe. How well does it work? It also sets the indication for the drug. So this is the situations in which you can use it. And this is really restricted to the data from the clinical trial. And this is where an indication is very important because once the drug is, if you're using it outside of an indication, this is where sometimes the funding gets tricky because Health Canada's role is to say, this is what the drug should be used for. Now, certainly sometimes drugs can be used outside an indication, and we often will do it, but sometimes pharmaceutical companies should reapply to expand their indication. And this is where once the drug is approved, the access to the drug is possible for other uses, but it may not be covered by the provinces for funding. Again, and then coming back to what the Canadian Drug Agency does, it's really this health technology assessment or health economics. And so this is really based on the data and what the listed cost of the drug is. So the listed cost is very different from the negotiated cost. I want to emphasize this. And what they're trying to figure out is what is the value of this drug? And there was many things to consider too. One is this a curable situation versus an incurable situation? And what is the quality of life values there? And there is a difference between what we'd say in a curable situation, we may tolerate toxicity a bit more because we're trying to certainly help people live longer without cancer. But we also need to factor in, if we're giving people toxicity, are we affecting their quality of life for the rest of their life, though? So we have to be careful there. Versus an incurable situation, we really want to make sure that people's quality of life is taken into account, as well as how much benefit are we giving in terms of that survival benefit. And then how do you define value from a health economic perspective? Like how much money per year makes sense? So the bar, although it's a gray area, they say is about $50,000 per life year gained is the approximate sort of bar. And the reason where that number comes from, and this is the rumor, they've never fully stated sometimes why or what the number is coming from how much dialysis costs. So how much does it cost to keep a person alive for an extra year if they're on dialysis? So that's because you need to have some sort of bar of what we feel would be kind of some sort of base for the population on a whole. And this is where the input from the clinicians and the patients are really important. Again, there is always a call out when new drugs go in for the clinicians to be putting in their input and also for the patients as well. What is that value to patients? And this is, again, we're coming back to the PCPA. This is really the price negotiations that sets that national price guideline. This also confirms the indication that the drug can be used. So remember at the beginning, we said Health Canada sets a certain indication. As it goes through CADTH or the CDA and PCPA, you can sort of push that indication a bit. So, for example, sometimes we say the trial was only done in stomach cancer, but we often will say esophageal cancer is very similar to stomach cancer, so that indication should be expanded to esophageal cancer. Or the trial had their eligibility a bit too tight. We feel in the real world situation, it should be expanded a bit more, and we try and do it that way. And then once that baseline price is negotiated, then the provinces go to the drug companies go to every province and renegotiate everything. And then they launch based on their own internal budgets and ability to implement. And so this is your pharmacy, chemo chair time, the support, the EMRs, everything. And so as much as we have this federal, national way of doing things, it's still largely, and you'll notice from province to provinces, there are differences in terms of how drugs are launched based on their ability to launch it and implement things. So sometimes this requires pathology in terms of testing. The Maritimes often has to send out some of their tests out to other parts of the country. Maybe a much more genomic-based test, which only certain parts of the country can do. There are certainly issues within every province. So unfortunately, as much as we'd say we have a national system, it's still very provincial. And this is where the patient support programs from the companies are helpful. So once a drug is approved by Health Canada, a company, and you'll often hear of some patients going on patient support programs. So a company will provide it for free while it's undergoing review through the Canadian Drug Agency and PCPA. And sometimes it's a time-limited offer, so they'll say, we're only going to do this for 2 years. Or they may limit to a number of patients. So Roche did this when Atezo-Bev was first going through the whole entire process for HCC. They said, we're only going to do it for 150 patients. And literally that program opened and closed within about 8 months nationally. So, I mean, every company does things differently. Sometimes they make it a lottery system, which makes it even more confusing. So, and this really depends on the company. One of the companies said, look, we only have so much drugs. So you put in your application and each month we're only going to have enough for 6 patients every month. So it's going to be a lottery. And so if there's 10 patients that month, they just made it a lottery and then it rolls over to next month, which is very stressful for everybody. These are not perfect systems and we are kind of held whim to the companies for this. Most time, they tend to be time-limited offers of like, we're going to do this for 2 years and hopefully all the negotiations are done. Sometimes with these patient support programs, especially from an infusion standpoint, Sometimes it can't be administered within the institution because it's really a drug that's being provided privately. So it may have to go through a private infusion clinic because, again, it's using an operations budget to infuse a treatment that isn't funded yet. So that's more of an institutional thing in some places. So it comes back to, and everyone asks, why is it so complicated? Well, the honest truth is, it is a big budget, and really, number one, we're trying to figure out safety. We need to ensure that the drugs that we're giving out are safe. And this is what happens in the media. You'll hear that, oh, this drug was done, like, and I think we all heard about the thalidomide issue where that was being given to pregnant women, and there are a lot of birth defects. And certainly we're very fortunate that doesn't happen as much anymore, but that's the number one thing is we want to make sure that drugs that are being approved are safe to give to people. The other issue is cost to the system. And right now, how it is once a drug is funded, it stays funded. So it's almost like an all or none decision-making process. So when governments want to ensure if they're going to commit to a drug, especially when it's going to cost millions of dollars a year, they want to make sure they get it right. And then the other part is the efficacy. You really want to make sure that this drug truly is working the way it's supposed to be working in a clinical trial. And I think this is the issue. Clinical trials represent only 10% of the patient population. If we really look at who's eligible for the trial, it's 10%. Yet we then apply that 10% to the other 90% and say, this is what that benefit is. And that's not always the case. And so there are issues with respect to, and I will acknowledge how clinical trials are designed. And a lot of it is because companies are investing hundreds of millions of dollars to see that this drug works. So they're trying to choose a population where they think it's going to work really well to get the data so that they can get the funding. And then this way, then you apply it to everybody. So it is a bit of a game to play. So we're talking about now, how can we make things better? How can we make things faster? So the Canadian Drug Agency is trying to look at newer methods to speed up the drug approval process. And my biggest criticism about what's been going on within drug regulation is, and I'm sure that this is the frustration from the patient aspect, is we've seen so much advances in terms of how we develop drugs with genomics, biomarkers. We have really changed how we do research on the drug development side. But it has taken a longer time for the regulatory side to sort of innovate on their end, and that's what's happening now. So what they're trying to do now is if the phase 2 data looks promising. So remember, phase 2 is where we're looking at that signal, maybe response rate, and maybe we get early signals about survival. And the phase 3 study is now open. There's a new process, what we call time-limited recommendation. So the drug could be reviewed and go through that entire process based on the phase 2 data. So not the phase 3 data yet, but the phase 2 data. And if it looks reasonable, what the CDA, Health Canada, and this whole entire process on the federal level has said, we will grant provisional funding until the phase 3 data is submitted and reviewed again. So this way, you can almost accelerate things by maybe an extra 2 to 3 years, because now we're going to look at it, but it's sort of like a very conditional recommendation. So it's thinking like now the drug is on probation. And then if the phase 3 data reads out and it looks sufficient, then it just says, okay, done. And all that negotiations has been done already. So now you're almost 2 to 3 years ahead of time. The caveat to that is if the phase 3 data does not show the benefit, then the funding gets pulled. So that's the main thing. But it's trying to get drugs into patients faster from that phase 2 perspective, but again, now having a more probationary period. So the hope is that this decreased time to access by about 2 years. So there are right now 2 drugs that have sort of gone through this process. And the most recent one I can use as an example of gastric cancer of TDX or trastuzumab deruxtecan. And because the phase 2 data looked very promising, went through the time limit recommendation, their phase 3 study actually read out much faster than anticipated. So literally the drug got its probationary funding in the spring of this year. And the phase 3 data literally just read out in the summer this year and was positive. The overall survival benefit was great. And this is now something that CDA is going to look at. So normally, had we gone through the regular process, this phase 3 data would have read out now, and probably we wouldn't have seen TDX funded for gastric cancer for probably about 2 years. We now actually have access to TDX right now for our patients with gastric cancer because of this time-limited recommendation based on the phase 2. So this actually has managed to speed up the process. Now, they can't use it for every single drug. This is still an experimental process that they're working on through certain drugs that meet this criteria. But at least it's a step forward in terms of trying to get things moving faster through our healthcare system. The real question is, and I think this is what probably the struggle, especially in cholangiocarcinoma, is what if a phase 3 trial can't be done? So can a drug only be improved based on phase 2 data? And I think the biggest thing, especially in cholangio, has been the case of pemigatinib. Now, it took a lot of time. We finally have the approval, and I think finally we got it negotiated. But now, if we look at this, FGFR fusions are now, I know the data says it's probably around 10%, but I think in real world data, the FGFR fusion only happens maybe in 5% of patients. So the problem is what happens when you have a rare tumor? Or you have tumors where you have a rare molecular predictive marker. So, and in cholangiocarcinoma, number one, you have a fusion that happens maybe 5, at most 10% of the time in cholangiocarcinomas. And then you have cholangiocarcinoma, which in itself is a relatively rare cancer. You're taking now something rare of rare. There's no way you're going to be able to do a phase 3 study because number one, you're going to need, say, 500 patients. And we're looking at maybe worldwide, you get, say, I don't know, 70 to 80 patients a year, of which only 10 to 20% are eligible for a clinical trial. Like it's going to take forever to accrue to this study. We're never going to get that data. And also, sometimes the phase 2 data looks amazing. I think there could be ethical considerations where you're like, I don't feel comfortable having my patient randomized to the non-pemigatinib arm. Because think about it, pemigatinib in the phase 2 data showed amazing response rates, tumors shrank, and because it was cholangiocarcinoma, we were seeing overall survival benefits, much almost like 1 to 2 years, which was unheard of in cholangiocarcinoma, especially in the second line. So if I had a patient and I was like, okay, we now have to put these patients in a randomization of pemigatinib versus the standard of care chemotherapy, and I knew this phase 2 data, am I going to be very comfortable randomizing a patient to chemotherapy? From the patient perspective, if you heard that data, is this a trial you would be comfortable going, well, hey, we have this potential drug that could help you live 2 years based on early phase data, but there's a 50-50 chance you might go in the standard of care, which at the time really is FOLFOX or 5-FU-oxaliplatin, where the benefit might be only like 6 to 8 weeks. I think most patients would struggle going, I guess I have to play the lottery to hope to get into that pemigatinib arm. So I think there's issues where we need to start looking, and this is where I think CDA is trying to look at phase 2 data, but from their perspective, when you have phase 2 data, you only have one arm, and it's not comparing to a standard of care. So they're like, we don't know what that true value is. And this is where it's trying to figure out, can you take historical data and compare it with the phase 2 data? So can you take data from the what we call real world data from the regular population and figure out what that survival, if people didn't get pemigatinib and had this marker, what is that benefit? The other part of it is, I think where I came back to is, the system is built on making this single decision about we're going to fund this and that's it. But this is not really, when you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. That's not what we kind of do in real life. If you think about your own household, you are always looking at your own budgets about trying to figure out what is the value you get of spending your money in which part of your household. So I always come back to your cell phone plan. Your cell phone plan has probably changed multiple times over the past decade. And that's because different things come out, different value, and so your plan's going to change. So this is probably where we should be trying to take the data from patients and put it back in the system and really evaluate, are we getting value for what we're paying for? And based on that, then we should reevaluate the costs and our contracts of the drugs. And so if we're paying, I don't know, $5,000 a month for a drug, but it's not really providing us the same benefit, then maybe we should renegotiate. If we're finding out in the real world situation, we're really not getting any benefit, do we delist that drug? I mean, this is being a bit controversial, delisting, but this is where we should be evaluating our contracts. And then that way, that first decision making about launching a drug doesn't have to have as much risk. So it's very similar to your household. You're always looking at changing things or subscriptions and reevaluating value. There's probably the biggest decision that you make is buying a home where you're going to spend lots of money. And like once you buy that home, that's almost like what you stay in for a long period of time. It's kind of like what the government does with drugs. Like they're like, this is the investment we're going to do moving forward. But what if there was a way that we're always reinvesting the data and saying, okay, let's reevaluate, reevaluate, reevaluate. And again, this is where the patient advocacy groups are really important. And I would say your input is probably more valuable than physician input because we always say we want the drug too, but we're not the ones who experience the disease. We're not the ones who experience what a drug can do for them. So, especially in cholangiocarcinoma, where let's be honest, survival is poor. Living 3 months longer, actually, in a disease site where the median survival is around 1 year, is huge. Because that's an extra almost like 20 to 30% in survival. Versus in other sites, like if you take like chronic lymphocytic leukemias or lymphomas, you could be living 10 years, 10 to 15 years, or gastrointestinal stromal tumors. So an additional 3 months may not have that same value. And, pancreatic cancer is very similar, where a 3 month survival benefit is very significant when you have a disease which is quite devastating and you may only live less than a year. So, and again, it's also incremental things. If we look at cholangiocarcinoma, where we've come, it's been very incremental in terms of that survival benefit, and people are living longer, but it's had to build it like 3 months at a time. HCC is another prime example where we didn't have a lot, and only lately we've been building on 3 months, 3 months, 3 months. But now that you get more sequential treatment, we now actually have patients living out 3 to 4 years. Like 20% of patients live with HCC live out to 4 to 5 years with metastatic disease. That was unheard of 5 years ago, but it took this incremental benefits. So this is where it's really important for patients to be putting in this feedback. So the main summary is we have a single payer system, and unfortunately, it does require more regulation and oversight to ensure the cost and value to the system. But I think we need to improve the data to reevaluate the value of drugs. Patient input is very key to how we get drugs funded. I will try and give the regulators some credit because I do think they're trying to innovate the system now. And this is where we're coming up to this time-limited recommendation. And this is trying to catch up to the innovation that's being done on the research side. So there's still lots of changes happening, but this is really the system that we have. And this is where it takes a whole team to try and figure out how do we navigate when a drug comes into a system, working with both the pharmaceutical companies and government to try to navigate this complex system to try to get the drugs faster to patients. Unfortunately, there are key roadblocks here and there, but this is where it's trying to figure out how do we make sure we navigate it properly to provide the best, indication and access to the drug for our patients. And with that, I will leave my slide up and I will quickly go in the chat and I can, okay.
Chats. Do you want to
Yeah,
read them out loud or?
I can read it.
Sure.
The Canadian Drug Agency has denied access to Pembro to patients who've been treated previously with durvalumab. The rationale seemed to be in the trial, there were no patients who participated in the trial who received durva, therefore excluded from the approval of the drug agency to fund this option. This leaves a patient who have MSS high DMMR who cannot access their second-line option of Pembro. How can patients affected by decision create an opportunity for this to be reviewed with the intent? Yeah, so unfortunately, there are pockets of patients where their just data cannot be generated and that's because there isn't a trial. So this is where the Canadian Drug Agency is trying to look at real world data. So where patients have been given, and so in this case, pembrolizumab post durva. Now, I think you're mentioning it. So the MSI high DMMR groups. So this is a little different. So for DMMR cancers, right now, for most GI cancers, there is a first-line option of some form of immunotherapy. Having said that, having retreatment with further immunotherapy post first-line immunotherapy in DMMR cancers is still somewhat controversial in terms of does that rechallenge with this very similar drug actually provide more benefit? So like Pembro versus Durva, I mean, I know there's some people who do try a rechallenge, but for the most part, I think that is controversial in terms of how that works. So let's say if there was real world data that supports that, I think that's where it's up to the company to be submitting it back to the CDA with real world data. So that has happened in the past where real world data has been tried to use to try and help with submissions, but it is a long process. So the thing is, because that's a very small niche uh, population, this is where the data is difficult to generate. So it's trying to figure out what are the ways we can generate data to help with these smaller populations. And then Bretta, you had a question for cost. Should Health Canada, oops, I got some icons here, or CDA review the drugs every 10 years, for example? Yeah, I mean, Health Canada is really about the safety and efficacy. And technically, from the Health Canada perspective, what should happen is if there's new toxicities that are seen, it's technically supposed to be reported back to Health Canada. So number one, so that's the safety perspective. Having said that, if there is a new safety issue, so let's say I give a drug and normally we know what are the main side effects, but let's say there's something just unforeseen that happens to my patient. Technically, I should report it to Health Canada. I'll admit in typical government fashion, I have to fill out like this almost 30-page document to send back to Health Canada. So the honest truth is a lot of toxicity goes unreported because it's just this onerous process to report it, to be very frank. Sometimes our pharmacists are good about helping us with this, but they don't make that process easier. In terms of the actual value and cost, I mean, I think it should be more of a real time. So I actually don't think it should be every 10 years. It probably should be sooner, but it should be almost like, I mean, nowadays with all the computing power, you would think the problem is the data sits in different silos with each province. And what the provinces need to do is make the data more available. And I think this is the thing we are balancing. So this is more of an administrative question is how do you balance patient privacy and your personal information versus government databases to look at quality of care and what data can we use and extract that maintains the privacy of the patient and at the same time help us determine what is the value that we're getting out of drugs. So number one, it's the health economists telling us these are the data sets we need. And then we have to go to privacy to say, is this reasonable to be extracting from patient data? And then on the third part, and the most important part is what do patients feel their data should be used for? And this is where it's a back and forth is some argue, well, the health system is paying for your healthcare, so we should be entitled to all your data, which I don't stand for. Don't get. And there's others who feel, we have to make sure we are being ethical in terms of maintaining the privacy of patients so that you trust the system with your data. And so this is where it is a very fine balance of trying to figure out what data can we use for quality of care without having to then consent every single patient for access to your data, but maintaining your privacy. So that's the big complicated administrative question that we're all still facing. Okay, why are drugs that are approved for liver cancer approved for cholangiocarcinoma, since most cholangiocarcinoma patients have mets to liver? They're both gastro. Mainly it's because cholangiocarcinoma versus HCC, they are very different cancers. So just because you have disease in the liver, so unfortunately the liver in itself tends to be where most cancers spread to. So number one, if you look at the liver's function is it's the big filter of your blood. So all the blood goes through, liver filters it out, takes out all the impurities, and then, I mean, that's essentially what it is designed for. So when cancer spreads, often it goes through the blood system, and then because the liver is the filter, that's where most mets seed out. So if you look at breast cancer, colon cancer, most solid tumors, you often will have metastasis in the liver. Versus liver cancer, hepatocellular carcinoma, that's the primary site. Cholangiocarcinoma is more in the bile ducts. So they're very different tissue types. So that's why the drugs that are approved for hepatocellular carcinoma are very different from cholangiocarcinoma because they're very different cancers. Even within the gastrointestinal tract, all the cancers are very different. And I'll take the example of gastric cancer versus colorectal cancer. You can argue it's still almost the same intestinal tube, but the pathology and the subtypes of cells that you see in your stomach are very different than what you see in your colon. And while the backbone of the chemotherapy, FOLFOX, is about the same, immunotherapy works much better in gastric cancer and very rarely works in colon cancer unless you have a mismatch repair enzyme deficiency in colon cancer. But just giving immunotherapy in colon cancer is not beneficial. Okay. Given the limited access to clinical trials for cholangiocarcinoma patients, would patient advocacy groups benefit from also focusing on niches that advocate for expanding indications and/or pan-tumor trial? Yeah, that's an excellent question. You know, so clinical trials in itself is a complicated thing on a number of issues. One is, especially in rare tumors, or you're looking at a molecular subtype, it is hard for institutions to run some of these trials because you may only enroll one patient. And if you were to run that trial at your center, keep in mind, clinical trials are not funded by the government. It's funded by the pharmaceutical company. So we almost run our trials units like a business. In order to make a clinical trial viable, you really have to, at minimum, accrue 2 to 3 patients. And the reason for that is we have to pay for the data coordinator. So clinical trials generate a lot of regulatory documents. So you need clinical trial nurse to help oversee the care with the physician of the patient, but it's also the documentation of everything. So we have a data coordinator, we have clerks, so it almost runs separately outside of the healthcare system in that sense in terms of the cost. So when you have these rare tumors, if you only enroll one patient, the cost of then putting in all that mechanism for the one patient normally loses money for the institution from that perspective. Now, what we try to do is offset it by running some larger trials. So maybe we have a colon cancer trial that is able to accrue more patients and make money, and then this allows you to run some of these rare trials, but this is where it's a balance. And this depends on the institution. And I'll be honest, as physicians, we're not great business people. We did not go into medicine to be in business, but you're trying to run it like a business so that we have managers And so this is why sometimes some of these trials aren't open all across the country because the institution can't afford to lose money on certain trials. So from the patient advocacy perspective, I think it is important to try and focus on the initiatives to look at how do you expand the indication. And this is probably where we are trying to work on real world data, either within Canada or outside of Canada. The pan-tumor trials, to a certain extent, are beneficial, and trying to get them up and running here, depending on where you are. And there's certainly like through the CCTG, there is more of a genomics-based pan-tumor trial called Capture, and this is based on if you've undergone tumor sequencing, you may be eligible for one of these arms within the trial. So there was like HER2 variants got certain anti-HER2 drugs, and there's like a CD4K arm. So there are these trials that are available, but I think pan-tumor trials are sort of waxing and waning depending on and also pan-tumor stuff through CDA is now gaining a bit more traction. So through the CDA, at least they've approved some pan-tumor stuff. So larotrectinib and entrectinib for NTRK cancers at least got approved. And now they finally approved pembrolizumab for dMMR, tumor agnostic. So I think the tricky part with pan-tumor trials was for the longest time, they weren't getting the drug approvals and funding that we were hoping for, but now that they are, so it's kind of swinging back and forth. So I do think it's important for patient advocacy groups to still, I know you have, again, on the advocacy part, you also have limited resources and time. For cholangiocarcinoma, I think it's really focusing on trying to expand the indications, to be quite frank. Okay. What is the process for a province to cover treatment costs for a drug that has been approved but not gone through the provincial? So a province won't cover a drug that has been approved, but because right now, if the province is going to start covering the drug before it's actually gone through the CDA or its own internal process, then you're kind of bypassing the entire process. So this is where it's the patient support programs that really come into play. Unfortunately, the province, I mean, it is different from province to province. I think pemigatinib is the only time we've seen it, some provinces circumvent the CDA process, but the process has been put in place so that the drug approval and the contracts have to go through before the province will fund it. Otherwise, if it's going to start funding it, then really there isn't a point to the process. Back to question one, why wouldn't Health Canada make the exception for the 1-2% that could be life-saving? Again, it's coming back to, it's not, Health Canada has to look at the data in totality and the safety and the efficacy. And the thing is, if there's a question about that efficacy and what it is, then it's not that they're not trying to make the exception. It's more, what is the quality of the data for them to make that decision? Two, the company may not have filed to Health Canada. So sometimes I think we all point to the system and say, why isn't the system doing this? I will also say sometimes you need to point to the drug companies and the process of the drug companies itself, right? So they may not be filing, and then it's not Health Canada. They're like, we never got the data. Number two, the real question is, and why do the drugs have to be this expensive? So keep in mind, like we talked about the patient support programs and how some companies say, we'll make it a lottery, we're going to make it time limited. So Roche made Atezo-Bev time limited, but Roche makes billions of dollars a year, right? So to make this drug available to patients while we're trying to get the drug approvals going isn't overly expensive for Roche either. And keep in mind, we're talking the list price. So when they submit the prices and what you see, and when we say it's $5,000 to $10,000 a month, that's not what it costs Roche to make it, right? It's no different than what if you go to the you know, you're looking at the wholesale cost versus the retail cost, right? So to a certain extent, I think we should also be coming back to the pharmaceutical companies saying, okay, I know they're trying to make money and they are a business. Don't get me wrong. They should make a business money. But sometimes they could make $1 billion less and probably make the drugs a bit cheaper and make it more accessible. Now, having said that, I mean, Canada has to be the way it is to make our drug costs the way it is. We're fortunate. We're probably on par with most European countries, and we're not the only country that has a process like this. A lot of European countries are very similar. Germany probably has the most efficient process, to be quite honest, but of course, leave it to the Germans to have the most efficient process. And the United States, as much as we look south and say, oh, they have this amazing healthcare, 30% of people don't get treated because they can't make it through the door because they don't have insurance. Probably another 40 to 50% still have to pay a copay. So they're still paying out of pocket probably $5,000 to $6,000 a month for some of their healthcare costs. The other thing is their drug care costs, their costs in terms of what they pay are probably on the order of can anywhere be 5 to 10 times more than what we pay in Canada, just because they have this very capitalist consumerist approach to healthcare. So if you think about economics, it's based on the demand and like it's health. People are going to pay whatever they want, like will pay to the maximum for health. And rightfully so, but that can also push prices up if you're looking at a competitive capitalist market because people will pay more versus what is that value. And so that's why the American system, to a certain extent, if you have money, the healthcare system works great in the US. But if you don't have money, the healthcare system actually isn't that great. And if you actually look at the outcomes in terms of oncology within the US versus Canada, the US actually rivals some second world nations more than Canada. Now, we got some things to fix in Canada, don't get me wrong. But I wouldn't say necessarily the US is always the best place to look. I'd look at Germany or some of the more European nations in terms of how they're running their healthcare system. And then how is POG beneficial to cholangio? So really, so what I'd say this POG or any genomics or comprehensive genomics testing is in cholangiocarcinoma or any solid tumor is more you're trying to figure out. So cholangiocarcinoma is number one. Because some of the drugs aren't funded, the testing isn't covered yet. And this is part of the problem. Whereas in cholangiocarcinoma, there are some targeted treatments that are helpful for cholangiocarcinoma. I'd say the most beneficial one is really the FGFR fusion. Occasionally, you might find the NTRK fusions. So any comprehensive genomic testing, though, outside of finding those fusions, sometimes you may find a target that might be helpful that's really outside the box. Like maybe you find a rare fusion, so there could be an NRG1 fusion, which are incredibly rare, or sometimes it is just these totally random variants that might work. So we know that with genomic testing in general, we can find something that is truly actionable, but we don't know if it's truly beneficial because really these actions are very rare, and so we don't always have data. So I'll give an example. PI3 kinase variants are very common in some cancers, and sometimes aspirin can target it. So I've given aspirin to some of my very last line patients as let's just try it, and I have to admit it hasn't worked. But that's technically that's targetable, but it wasn't beneficial. And this is where the data is still coming out. So this is where I think comprehensive genomic testing is there to help drive the research forward, and it might provide some benefit to patients. But you are looking at trying to find, like, the standard of care is still the number one option for patients. And as we go through that genomic testing, sometimes we can find things in the kitchen cupboard. Sometimes it's helpful and sometimes it isn't. And that's where it's really a bit of a crapshoot. Okay. Any other questions?
Doesn't look like it. But I want to thank you very much for your time and informative webinar. The approval process is quite involved and lengthy, and it gave everybody a better understanding of the process. For example, that the time-limited recommendation application was interesting to hear too. It's nice to know that patient input is important and to have it reinforced to include as many patients as possible when we're doing our HTA submissions. Thank you.
Yeah, I would say honestly, and I've sat on the other side as a contractor for CDA reviewing these files. They really value patient input, and it is the most important thing. And like I said, honestly, the system listens to patients more than they listen to physicians. So you really have the biggest voice.
Thanks, Thanks, Dr. Lim.
My pleasure.
And we've got a lot of thank yous here.
Yeah, thank you. And once again, thank you to all of you. I mean, I know all of you are working really hard at trying to push the system. So that's what it requires. For change to happen, things have to be, the system has to be told that but on the whole, I will say our system does work relatively well. There's definitely improvements we got to do, but but this is where patients really help us move things forward.
That's awesome. Thank you.